In this recording, I'm going to examine a political trope which is a important theme in political consciousness that is bandied about across the spectrum, the left and right divide, and whatever. Well, I mean, it's something that's thought about. I'm going to try and put some clarity on it. So let's get one thing straight. How Russia is politically organized is, I mean, it has the same fundamental mismatch or problem that almost China has, um, said slightly differently. But essentially, I mean, many political arenas essentially have a democratic gap in them, have quite a stark democratic gap. Um, and it's very important that blame is correctly placed on the right entities for that democratic gap, because otherwise there's no hope in ever filling it in. But also, a lot of blame must be channeled towards the electorate themselves, because they are part of the culture that maintains the status quo. And it's often the revolutionary ideologies which, quite ironically, entrench the decadence and effectively are the other side of the coin of the plutocrat. You know, they are the demagogue's best friend, because they falsely reduce the problems. They produce false solutions, which essentially lend more power to the thing that is actually keeping the issues in place, so that they cannot be dealt with. And so it's this sort of revivifying what becomes a kind of incessant, in, recurring ideological complaint. Okay, so I'll start with Russia. So, you know, I can be very sympathetic to Vladimir Putin, because he's got a juggling act. You know, so he has to provide services in some sense, or he has to maintain a precarious situation in which he's got the people of Russia on one hand and oligarchs on the other hand. And he has to essentially stop the oligarchs from messing up the real economy to such an extent to which that they become an unbearable burden, and an obstacle to what would otherwise be a more fluid, organic uh, uh, developmental arc. And essentially, what has happened in modern day Russia, which is, I would say, slightly disconcerting, and it is a dark tone which has set the stage of geopolitics of today in this essentially neo-Cold War to some extent. Although I think that this might come more from China than it does from Russia, although perhaps maybe it's Chinese money and Russian resources, because Russia already had these apparatus set up, from the Cold War, from the proper Cold War. Anyway, the KGB, for example, but and that kind of political warfare, as it were. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that essentially there is in the political arena, essentially the political powers that be are essentially selling to the people Russian nationalism in lieu of genuine, let's say, developmental reform and progress and good governance, and, you know, just sort of transparent. You know, so essentially the kind of selling people protection for their Russian identity comes at a cost, which is almost a necessary compromise within the realm of the powers and the power arrangement that is in Russia, which is very precarious, which is why I can say that I have sympathy with Vladimir Putin, trying to make the best of a bad situation, perhaps stuck between a rock and a hard place, as it were. Now, China has a similar but yet a more fundamentally insidious problem, because for them it's not oligarchy which is the weight, the milestone around their neck. It is the conservation of the political uh, uh, the reproduction of their political stability, or the how the Chinese political status quo, how it has to reproduce its power relations, is essentially the milestones. The Communist Party itself is essentially the obstacle to a more uh, liberal, decentralized, empowering, meritocratic sort of ethos. Because essentially, and how the party keeps in power is that it essentially employs most of the people, or a good section of the people. It employs such a, effectively the Communist Party is the biggest employer in China. That is how it um, guarantees its, and so it doesn't employ everyone, but it employs a lot of people, and so it's kind of like a a monopoly. But it's a monopoly in the market itself. And so if you aren't a member of that monopoly, if you're on the outside, it's obviously very troubling because you're essentially a free enterpriser. And if you do something that's disruptive to the monopoly or that challenges the power of the monopoly and you try to innovate, you're both a necessary jolt in the system because innovators actually make things better, but you're also, um, so essentially the actual formula of progress, the actual formula, which is why China essentially has never been, and and this is the problem, is that now they're moving into the phase in which they actually do have to have their own homegrown innovation, but they don't have the the medium in which to cultivate it because of this holdover of the necessity of the reproduction of their political arrangement, um, the intergenerational reproduction of it. That it has to reaffirm itself, it has to reinvent itself, or restruct, or it has to maintain itself through generational progression, um, or I mean progression in the sense of just the natural procession of time. In the future, it has to um, continue in terms of how it does that how it performs that process of continuation. Anyway, so the biggest the biggest problem that China has is the political party in some sense. And the question is, can the party adapt itself? Can it change itself? Can it reimagine itself? Can it adapt itself? And this is fundamentally problematic. It's potentially capable of doing so. It's obviously, if it were to reform itself, then it might suffer internal fracturing and destabilization and an internal um, insurrection potentially. If reform carries with it a certain, if it's not, because essentially of the kind of democratic deficit in China, which is obviously much more huge, means that any kind of potential reform is potentially a lot more viable. Obviously, more stable societies are ones in which um, either the democratic gap is well um, seen, is well conceived of by culture, is well known and agreed upon in a very stable consensus as to what exactly the structure and the contents of the democratic gap are, and perhaps there's a common understanding of what could fill that void, um, what could bridge that gap. Then you could have a very stable sort of thing, of a solution. Um, That's why some revolutions don't have to be bloody. Some revolutions can be very orderly and, in fact, edifying to the ethical structure of a society. Um, the South African Revolution would be an example of this. I mean, obviously, I don't know how history is going to unfold in the future, but we must just remember that the South African case uh, was framed very differently even 15 years ago, and it really genuinely held a lot of authentic hope within it. And we must not forget essentially the best and only and believe it to be in this new framework, which is obviously makes it look like a shambles and a joke, as it has been undermined from every direction, as non-racialism has essentially been abandoned as a principle, which I would say is part of this political theme of this kind of national identity, political trick of delivering to a population national identity in supplementation of authentic democratic, let's say, representation or governance in their interest. So almost giving them national identity in supplementation of looking after the real national interest. So I just want to point out that that is the problem, is when national identity has baked within it the subversion of the actual national interest. Obviously, China is also slightly more complicated because on the ideological front, there is obviously not. There is some appetite, but there isn't a popular appetite for democracy. Democracy has been uh, uh, capably debunked, as it were, by the Chinese education system and propaganda, and certainly if you look at things like the kind of Democratic Party in America, that's almost the poster child in China for why democracy is a shambles. Because I mean, the Democratic Party in the American political system is just such a joke. It is so overtly corrupt. It's so overtly against the national interest. In some sense, what has been sold to the Chinese, which makes it slightly harder to look at some of these deficits in a British liberal political consciousness frame of mind, and democratically, sort of grounded, is that, well, the Communist Party in some sense is just seen as being necessary to a necessary instrument for having any hope of achieving something like a national interest. I would say that the problem is that the lack of emphasis on the individual political consciousness, or the political consciousness of individuals, um, to engage in things like freedom of association and free speech and things like that, um, undermines the natural cultural manifestation of a society that can function at an optimum. Um, in terms of having a legal system, for instance, that has the right mind to weigh properly um, the interests for example, those people who challenge the incumbent power of the monopolies, or of the monopoly that is the requisite for political control of the Communist Party, but also the which then subverts the economic interests of the national interest. So it's, the only way to properly adjudicate between weighing those interests is a cultural ethos that um, essentially has liberty and measuring liberty, because liberties do come into conflict perhaps with other people's liberties, and they do need to be adjudicated over, and you do need to develop jurisprudence, but without the correct sort of cultural ethical framework you'll never strike the right balance, and then you'll end up creating very um, dehumanizing, uh, undignified conditions of the soul, I would even say, but also that will manifest on a kind of systemic level that will be baked into the system, that will kind of be an injustice. Um, because when you believe that that the ends justify the means, and that's framed, and the ends are framed by an ideological vision of something in which there's a kind of sacred cow, you don't even have a proper value structure from which to extract principles and reasoning that can articulate um, and operate a sophisticated enough and dynamic enough functionality that can support a modern um, uh, 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 generative society, or flourishing society is what I mean by generative. Anyway, now these themes have been crazily imputed to, for example, President Trump by the Democratic Party, which is quite ironic, just because he talks about nationalism, and then they also try to call him like uh, like a Nazi or something like that because he talks about nationalism. I mean, this is just utter insanity. It's completely ludicrous. Civic nationalism is nothing like National Socialism, is nothing like the Nazis. Civic nationalism, of the variety of Donald Trump's, I might add, is non-racialist, is expressly non-racialist. But non-racialism to the anti-racist worldview, to the so-called anti-racists, um, is what they they label that racism. So I mean, like it's ironic because their version of social justice is what the Nazis would have been happy to call social justice. So I mean, it's the shoe is quite on the other foot. Um, but anyway, okay, that's basically the conclusion of this thought, and I just wanted to bring that to bear, is that the kinds of things happening in China and Russia are really the opposites of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's style of politics, which is really, in essence, um, the right cultural slogan for reviving the character of Western society and how Western society is framed. Um, the attempt to kind of uh, debunk him by using what I would describe as bunk rhetoric uh, uh, and just retarded political interpretation, which is literally intellectually dishonest and intellectually bankrupt, um, while at the same time actually endorsing the style of democratic gap in China and the style of democratic gap in Russia, because those are quaint cultural proclivities that must be given their wide berth. That every, like somehow, if you have an identity, you're beyond criticism, except if somebody else shares the same label. That's what the so-called left is. Which is, as far as I can see, that's the fascist worldview right there, which is that everyone just has their own ethno-state or something like that, and they just should get on with it internally, and it doesn't matter what they do. We only care about the particular ideological scapegoat, about what they do, because we need them, because without our emotional narrative being projected onto them and using them as essentially the bad guy, we have no sense of direction without it, and without sort of inciting them to some kind of into some kind of accusatory drama. We wouldn't even be able to see our own narrative, or be aware of it. We would lose sight of it because it would be too abstract, without sort of having a kind of this ideological protagonist or antagonist to assert ourselves as the protagonist. That's how the identitarians function. Is they need an opposing force in order to ground all their bullshit, essentially. And this is the kind of fake revolutionary that I was sort of talking about, and this disgusting kind of radicalism, which is all proto-fascism. So yeah, I wanted to get into that kind of the proto-fascism identitarian ideology in relation to the democratic gap, and to see which countries actually have this as a problem and which countries don't. And the kind of Trumpian campaign and message certainly does not suffer from this. And it's quite stark that his political rivals, the Democratic Party, are the number one, or must at least be punished for exemplifying that kind of corruption more. And in some sense, the elements that represent the same kind of corruption on the Republican side are kind of like, are the never Trumpers. So he has actually created the perfect divisions within politics to see more clearly what's going on. To put a finer point on it, and to specify exactly what I mean by the Democratic Party forwarding an ideology and an agenda which has implicit within it quite a grievous and massive democratic gap, which is effectively that their ideology is centered around the identity and identity politics, at least at the moment. And so they want a democratic gap in furtherance of the cause of the identity, in furtherance of the higher morality of identity politics. And because they believe that all moral consideration is invested in the identity and issues forth from all moral consideration issues forth from the identity, that to them is more important than democracy, and they will steamroll individual rights, they will steamroll freedoms, and in the same way that I was trying to explain how essentially when you lose that kind of cultural framework, when you lose that kind of societal ethos, nothing works. The judiciary doesn't work. Everything needs to get a mandate from the ideology. It needs to be infused and transcribed or translated from the ideological doctrine. And then you get this kind of disgusting legal positivism, which was the same kind of corruption of the law in Nazi Germany that we see in modern day every country, pretty much. Kind of on the kinds of creep and the kinds of corruption that have happened in line with Lord Sumption's Reed lectures on the creeping expanse of law's empire, but also how the law is changed in terms of its relationship to the citizen, which no longer becomes a participant in its development, is no longer, this is anyway, I've got particular arguments where I argue that the South African legal structure is actually the most superior legal structure in the world, but that's a much, I go into recordings where I go into that, but it has the best of everything, really. But sadly, it's been diluted. It's been corrupted with these kinds of these new modern legal theories that have completely rewritten the interpretation of even the rule of law, which was strongest in the form of South Africa. But obviously, when you've got people with essentially rotten mentalities running the show and essentially reframing and deriding the founding values, and you have President Nelson Mandela used to not sign a bill because he knew that it did not meet the requirements of the rule of law. Just to show how far afield we've gotten, and now we have a so-called Chief Justice who during his term that role was invented essentially for him, and we've got a public protector. Well, I'm going to release a recording on that. I think I'll call it the public protector and the Chief Justice, two ideological birds of a feather, debauching the Constitution together. But that is how these people travel. They travel in packs. The wolf tribe, the Dostoevsky, the poetry of Dostoevsky. I'm so bad with names. I can't pronounce Russian names, but anyway. Maybe I've even got the author wrong. Anyway, it's not important. Okay, well, let me just end this recording on that note.